well, welcome everyone. My name is Amy Reesner. I am a member of the League of Women Voters of Lynn County. The League is a nonprofit, volunteer political organization. It doesn't support or oppose candidates. Rather, it is here to ensure that there's participation in government. And it's open to any citizen 18 years or older. This forum is part of a process for educating voters and helping voters make informed decisions at the polls. We hope that over the course of this forum, you will learn more about the candidates and their positions and what they hope to do in elected office. So with me today in this candidates forum is Mark Seidel and Ashley Henson. We did a coin toss earlier, and we will proceed just in a moment with opening statements. Each candidate is getting 2 minutes to open. And Ashley won the coin toss, so she's elected to go second. For your information, we're going to go through that process, then we're going to have questions that you all are submitting on these yellow slips of paper. If you have a question written out, please raise your hand and a league member will come around and collect it and bring it forward. I don't select subject matter. I ask as many questions as I possibly can. Sometimes, because I'm a lawyer, I like to group things together because it just seems to naturally fit or flow. If there are more than one question that is similar, I may just ask them kind of as in a composite type question. And then if I think of a follow-up question, it's my prerogative to ask it, and I might do that. But feel free, if you have follow-up questions, to pass them forward. The forum is being taped. At the back, you can see Robin Cash of Neighborhood Network News. Thank you, Robin, as always. And you will be able to watch this at the League of Women Voters website, as well as neighborhoodnetworknews.com. Reminder, please turn off your cell phones or silence your cell phones now. And in an effort to be as civil and professional as possible, I ask that you hold your applause at the end, and please don't shout out or make any commentary regarding candidates' positions. We want both candidates to have a fair opportunity to say what they have to say without interruption, please. If there are any questions, again, there are folks with League of Women Voters badges coming around, so if you have a question or concern, please address it to a volunteer. Janet's standing over here. Right in front are the women that are taking the questions in and making sure they're readable. And then we also have our timers in the front who will be managing the timing. So that's everything for all of the process, other than to thank both of the candidates for their time and effort in running for elected office. I'm proud to belong to a community and a state where we have highly qualified and thoughtful individuals who are running for office, so we very much appreciate your efforts on all of our behalf. And then thank you all for participating by coming out this evening. I look forward to this process, and I look forward to all of your questions. And you too may have a seat or stand, whichever you prefer.
Thank you.
Okay. And we'll start off with our opening statement, which is 2 minutes, and Mark will go first.
Hopefully I don't have too much difficulty with this microphone. Is it working?
It should be.
Can people hear me in back? Okay. All right. Well, if the microphone doesn't work, I'll speak up enough that I hope that everyone will be able to hear what I say. My name's Mark Seidel, and I'm 57 years old. I've been a resident of this district for almost all of the last 50 years. I grew up on Brentwood Drive in Bowman Woods amongst all those Rockwell engineers that were busy devising the telecommunication equipment that went to the moon. I went to Catholic grade school and high school, and I graduated from Regis in 1977. After that, I went away to Omaha and went to first undergraduate and then law school. I got my law degree at the Creighton University in 1984. And I've been an attorney ever since. I've been practicing in Cedar Rapids since 1990. First with the Tom Riley Law Firm, where I learned a lot. And then since 1997, practicing with my brother Phil and my sister Mary, who's now a district court judge, Mary Chikelli. So our law office is also in the district. I'm married. I married my wife, Ann, in 1990. We first lived in a small apartment on Peary Drive in Hiawatha in the district. And after a year or so, we moved to a house in the north edge of Marion, where we lived for a couple of years in the district. I've been in this district and I've been in this state a long, long time. When you live somewhere long enough, you feel an obligation to help take care of it. And I believe that there are some things that we need to do as Iowans for our state. There are responsibilities that we've neglected. There are promises that we need to keep. And the reason that I'm running for office is because I want to make good on those promises, and I want to make Iowa the best state it can be. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ashley? Can you all hear me? Whoa. Wow. Yeah, you can hear me. Okay. My name is Ashley Hinson. I am almost always a lifelong Iowan as well. I spent a couple of years away for college and then worked 1 year in Grand Junction. Born and raised in Des Moines, Iowa. My parents still live there, which is, of course, an exciting prospect, getting to get back to Des Moines maybe and spend some time at home again. They told me that I am the only of our their three children that they ever thought might actually be at home ever again. So I obviously have lived here in Eastern Iowa since 2005, when I was hired at KCRG TV9 as an anchor there, anchor and reporter, where I served as a journalist for over a decade. I spent that time asking questions and telling Eastern Iowa's stories on the air, and kind of navigating through a lot of some crisis times as well. I learned a lot as well in that time. I guess I should add too as well, I'm 33 years old. I'm a woman who will tell how old she is, so there we go. I know we're going to talk a lot about policy tonight, so I want to focus on my leadership style because I think that's also very, very important. I plan to go to Des Moines and lead with what I call the 3 C's in mind. That is communication, number 1, collaboration, number 2, and then creativity, number 3. And I'm going to do that. Communication obviously is vital to making sure that you make good policy and that you communicate with your constituents. That's number 1 priority for me. Number 2 priority for me is to collaborate and make sure that we're working together. Nothing gets done in Des Moines if you don't collaborate. So let's face it, that's really, really important. And number 3, creativity. I think you need to think outside of the box in order to make good policy. So that's how I plan to lead, and I will take those goals to Des Moines. I agree with Mark, there's a lot of things that we can do here in Iowa to make it great and a great state. I plan to do that, and I want to leave a great legacy for my 2 children, Max and Jax, 5 and 3, and my beautiful husband, Matt, who's here supporting me tonight as well. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we hope that we've got the microphone situation resolved, but if we didn't, we had discussed we may just have to pass back and forth so that we make sure everyone's fairly heard. Okay. Thank you very much for both of your opening statements. Let's move on now to some questions, and there was a very good opening question I remember seeing, and that was someone asking about priorities, and they wanted to know your top 3 priorities when you go to the State House if elected. So let's start with Ashley with question number 1.
Well, I would say my top priority is, as a mother of a 5-year-old who just started kindergarten this year, making sure education is something we focus on as a state. It's obviously the thing we spend the most on in our budget. We spend approximately 55% of our state budget on education. And it's something I know I am devoted to making sure that we leave our children with even a better legacy than what I experienced going through Iowa's school system. I think there are some things that we can focus on in education. Number 1, changing the funding model to make it less political and more focused on what the state can pay. Let's make it a formula-based system so we don't have to worry about the politics. And then we can focus on what's happening in the classrooms. I would also like to see some tax reform happen. I don't think we're being as competitive as a state for business as we can, and I think that's our key to creating jobs. So I do want to be a part of some comprehensive tax reform going forward. And I think also we need to make a real concerted effort to keep Iowa people here. We are facing a major worker shortage in the next 5 years or so. I think it's about 500 people we're going to be short. So we need to make sure that that's a priority, doing whatever we can to keep people here.
Okay. Let's try your mic and see if it works, and if it doesn't, we'll pass.
How's this going? Okay.
Right. Okay.
All right. Well, my first priority, I would agree with Ashley, is going to be education. However, I think we perceive things a little bit differently. There is a formula for education. It's called allowable growth, and for the last 6 years, that's been ignored. It's supposed to be 3 to 4% a year. We've managed that once of the last 6 years. What does it mean when you don't have allowable growth in education spending? It means, as I've heard several times on the campaign trail knocking doors, 32 kids in a classroom. We need more teachers, and we need smaller class sizes. And if we need to depoliticize it, the first thing to do is to allocate the funds necessary to get the job done. Second, we need to clean up the waters of the state of Iowa. You can't swim at a state park beach. There's a nutrient reduction strategy in place. It needs to be funded. We run tight budgets, and we need to fund that strategy, and it'll have to come from a new source, as I have defined it, of paying for that. And finally, and this is something I think we really need to do, in fairness to the people who have the need, as well as in order to take care of the people that provide for them, and what I call Terry care, the privatization of Medicaid.
The candidates have hit upon a number of topics that were already in your questions, so that's good. We'll move along and ask some of those questions then. So one of them was education. What is your plan to help improve and fund Iowa's education system? If you could spend your minute on that, we'll go to Mark.
I don't believe that all problems can be solved with money. However, when you look at education, when you look at what's been happening for the past year, when you look at depriving children in the Cedar Rapids School District of foreign language programs in their grade schools, when you look at the way that we've cut librarians in the schools, when we look at the fact that we're denying services to our children because of lack of funding, we need the funding to put those librarians out there, to put those teachers out there, and to provide our children with a quality education. There's no better determinant of success in a classroom than the number of children per teacher, and as I've indicated, we do not have enough teachers. Another thing I frequently hear at the doors is teaching is not being considered, not being dignified as the profession that it is. We're simply not putting our money where our mouth is when it comes to education. We put a schoolhouse on our quarter. However, we're not providing resources to our schools or to our teachers, and that goes from the AEA on up to the Regents institutions.
Thank you.
I briefly touched on the funding model that I would propose, which would have a floor and a ceiling as well, that would get us to what we can afford to pay as a state, which I think is responsible, and that's teaching a good example of budgeting to our children. We're not doing a very good job of spending our dollars if it doesn't make sense as well on the other end. So I think we need to set a good example that way. I do think class size is important. However we can reduce that is important. I don't think that's the only solution. I think we do need to be talking about the curriculum that our students are learning. Is it preparing them properly based upon the challenges of today's environment? I think that's a question that hasn't been asked recently or enough. And that's something I hope to do. I actually attended an education committee meeting this past legislative session and got a chance to really get in there. It was hard for me as a journalist to sit there and not answer or raise my hand to ask questions, but I plan to go in and ask the right questions so we have those conversations going forward. I want to be a leader on making sure that we address curriculum as it's important in Iowa's classrooms.
Thank you. Next question is somewhat related on education, and that's funding college and how we expect families and students to pay for college, whether it's community college or a university. So what are your thoughts about how to make it affordable for students and families? And we'll go back with Ashley.
I think we need to start by doing a better job of educating families on the 511 savings plans that are available and putting money away in advance. That is a great tool that people can use to plan effectively and save money for college starting, I think I started when my children were born. So I'm trying to do my part as a parent to set them up for great success. But college is not for everybody, so let's first of all say that. I think that a lot of people go to college without realizing their path, and it can be a very, very expensive mistake. So I think we need to make sure that everybody understands what is involved in the expense of going to college and change that dialogue a little bit earlier on. As far as affordability, I think we do need to equalize. I did meet with the president of Kirkwood Community College, who obviously were in their facility tonight, and they are not funded at the same level even as private colleges are in the state. So I do think that we need to do some work on equitable funding for community colleges so that they can continue to provide the access to trade programs, which is, I think, vital to our state's future.
Thank you. Mark.
Well, I've got a soft spot in my heart for the community colleges. I started my college in Kirkwood, and for that matter, my son Daniel has attended Kirkwood before. They're excellent. However, when they asked for a $21 million appropriation in this last budget, they got 6. Nonetheless, the Department of Economic Development found $12 million to give to Prestige Farms to build a plant in Wright County. So apparently the priorities of this governor and this government have been our children should grow up to slaughter hogs, not get degrees. The money's there, and we can support our community colleges. Yes, the Regents institution isn't for everybody. Well, put our money where our mouth is. That's the future for some of our children, and certainly we should provide for that future. A 529 plan is fine, but I'm an attorney and I have one and I can afford one. I have the disposable income. There are a lot of very bright kids in this state that do not. And the funding for Regents institutions in terms of constant dollars has dropped continuously since 1980. Tuition just in the last couple of years is up about 15%. There again, something we have to invest in the future for our children.
Well, let me ask a follow-up question because you raised it, and I don't think we actually talk about this frequently enough, and that is there are other paths for people to become educated and to have a living wage, a good life. So let's talk about trade schools and perhaps what the government should or could be doing, or should it be a private business issue? Feel free to take a stab at trade schools.
Well, you have schools, of course, at the unions. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, the unions have also offered schooling and education and things like sheet metal and plumbing and so forth. There's an excellent education that's available in the trade union halls, and that should not be neglected either. And for that matter, Kirkwood provides the same education, and they graduate people in auto mechanics and everything else. But again, if you're going to support those institutions, you'd better support those institutions. We are not making that investment at this point in time. And if college isn't for everybody, this kind of leads into another concern that I think we have. The minimum wage hasn't gone up for so long that right now, basically at the minimum wage, you're getting paid less. I worked minimum wage in 1976, it was $2.30. In inflation-adjusted dollars, that would be $9.67 today. The minimum wage is $7.25. For Iowans who can't afford college or much else, I think we should have a $10 state minimum wage. But primarily, invest in our community colleges, give them the funds they've asked for.
Thank you.
I think that the state has shown it is interested in making sure the trades are successful. Year over year, in the past several years, we've invested in apprenticeship programs in Iowa that are in local businesses in our district here. I met with the leaders at Price Industrial. They are embracing it. It is in many union shops as well in this area where they are training people and making sure they take them on and then nurturing that talent, making sure that they're in the pipeline for the future. And I think that we do need to do a good job as a state of investing in those apprenticeship programs as well. And I do think that it actually starts before college. I think that we have a unique model here in Eastern Iowa with Iowa Big School. It's a program through the Cedar Rapids schools that's focusing on making those community connections, public-private partnerships with businesses, and state funding for those students as well. But it's giving students exposure to other things that they might not get in a sit-and-get classroom setting. And I think that that's our way of getting those students interested in things other than a traditional college experience.
Thank you both. While the topic has come up, let's go to jobs, minimum wage. Mark raised this issue, but how do you feel about the fact that there have been multiple communities, counties that are changing minimum wage? Is that a trend that you want to see at the state level?
I think it does need to be state level. I think we've seen what happens when counties take action on it. I don't disagree that there needs to be action on it at the state level. I also work for minimum wage. I'll probably date myself by saying I was $5.25 an hour. But I think it is important that we address that at the state level. We're seeing cities opt out what seems like monthly at this point because, of course, the supervisors and counties are taking action on it. So I can't tell you what number I would support because I think we need to make sure that we're asking all the questions of our local business owners first, taking into account inflation, cost of living, CPI, all sorts of different economic indicators before we just lay a blanket number on it. I do agree I want to be a part of that conversation in Des Moines, and I do think the state needs to take action on it.
Okay, thank you. Other comments, Mark?
Well, I think I've already indicated I think it should be $10, and basically the math is, again, that $2.30 in 1976 is $9.67 now. With 2% inflation, it'll be $9.86 in a year by the time I'm in the legislature. So just round it up slightly. And as far as whether that's a justifiable wage or not, explain to me why somebody getting an introductory job, a first job in this economy, deserves less than his parents got when they started. I don't understand that. As far as, yes, I don't agree with this sort of piecemeal approach statewide where different cities and different counties have been coming up with different levels, and Des Moines even comes up with different levels for people to get tips and so forth. But I think that you need a statewide wage. What we are really seeing, though, is a complete absence of state leadership on the part of the majority caucus in the House of Representatives and this governor. And if you want to see something happen on the statewide level about one common minimum wage, you need to change that leadership.
Thank you. On this note, let's talk about the next question, jobs. How do you think that you can work to create jobs in the State House? Mark?
I want to differentiate between the kind of job creation that works and the kind of job creation that doesn't work. And when I am interested in cleaning up the environment of this state, the waters of this state, when I'm interested in investing in education in this state, I'm talking about things that are quality of life issues, because I think what motivates people to live, to work, and to locate a business in a community is that quality of life that they find there. I don't know how many Rockwell engineers would want to come here if they didn't think that they were going to get an excellent education for their children. By supporting the infrastructure of the state, that is how you attract business. What you don't do to attract business, however, is what the Iowa Economic Development Board has been doing, which tends to be handing out corporate welfare like it's candy. I mean, I mentioned the $12 million that went to Prestige Farm, or the $82 million that went to Orascom to build a fertilizer plant, which turned into a debacle. Or for that matter, they gave Kraft Heinz $4.7 million to cut 475 jobs because they kept a few of them. I mean, if we're going to invest, that's not the way.
I think I would start by, as I mentioned, I would like to be a part of some comprehensive tax reform. I've had a chance to meet with the director of the Iowa Department of Economic Development, who I do think is actually doing a good job recruiting some businesses for our state. Mark and I think, disagree a little bit on our approach in applying tax credits. I do agree tax credits should not be thrown at everything, and we need to be careful in how we're applying those. And they should be regularly looked at to make sure they're doing what they intended. I will say this, though, I think we need to do some comprehensive tax reform. On paper right now, our state looks semi-unattractive to businesses to relocate here and set up shop. Our tax rate, I believe, is about 12%, but by the time you throw tax credits at something, it's less. So I think we just should bite the bullet on it. Let's lower that tax rate. Let's be competitive. Let's entice those businesses to come here and bring people here. I think millennial generation is the first generation that does care more about the place they live and the job they have. So I agree we do need to make Iowa an attractive place on many fronts, and I, as a millennial, am proud to go and represent you and do that in the State House.
Thank you. Next subject is environment and climate change, and this person poses two questions. So why don't we go 2 minutes for each of these folks on this topic? It's 1 minute's awfully short. So let's talk about climate change. The first question is, do you believe that it's real? And the second question is, if yes, then what would you do in order to reverse climate change? And we'll start with Ashley.
Well, I don't doubt that things are changing. I know our Earth does go through natural cycles, and I actually talked to a man the other day who had just taken a climate change class when I knocked on his door, and so we had a pretty healthy discussion about it at the door in Marion. I will say this, I know we need to, as a state, continue our investment in renewable fuels and renewable technologies. I think that's the way we, as not only a state, but as a country, help to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, which is, I think, a good thing, whether or not you're trying to combat climate change or just reduce our dependence on foreign oil. So I think we've done a really good job of investing in ethanol, wind energy. Just recently, Alliant announced that they're building a giant wind farm up in, I believe it's Franklin County. I was proud to be at that announcement, and I support that kind of investment in our state's future with wind energy. I think I knocked on another man's door. He works at an ethanol plant. He drives back and forth to Waterloo actually every day. Lives in our district. And he told me, I think it's 2 out of 3 rows of corn at this point are planted that specifically go to support the ethanol industry in Iowa. So I think that's a really, really great start. We need to continue to support those industries here in our state. And I do think we are becoming an energy leader for the entire country to model itself after going forward.
Okay, thank you. Do you need me to reread the?
Oh, that's
questions? You
okay.
got it? Okay.
Was everybody here 2 weeks ago? Okay, you saw a symptom of what's happening. It's climate change that is causing more flooding in the watersheds of this state. It's causing problems that we witness if you've noticed what your winters have been like. The facts are right in front of you, and if you don't choose to believe it, you're living under a volcano. Yeah. You always wonder in the movie about the people that live under the volcano, why the city fathers can't convince them when it's going to erupt that they should move. And when it does, and bad things happen, and the river floods, and they bring out the HESCO barriers and all of it, nobody asks the question, well, why didn't we do something about the fact that we live under a volcano? You know, you're looking at a problem that we, on the other hand, can solve. And we can be leaders about it. We're a state that generates 24% of its electricity from renewable sources. There are excellent initiatives that have taken place. Just in the last few months, the Utilities Board has been working on new rules in regard to the production of solar energy and allowing people to use net metering when they're renting their solar arrays. I've often thought that if this state committed itself to an Apollo-like goal, and I know what an Apollo goal is from when I grew up amongst a bunch of engineers that were achieving one, this state could become an energy exporter without pumping an ounce of oil, without mining a speck of coal. Because we've got it. We've got it from the winds, and we've got it from the waters, and we've got it from the sun. And we can do that. And we can produce ethanol. And I don't worry about dependence on foreign oil. We're an oil exporting nation now, actually, if you missed that. But what it's doing and what it was predicted to do to our environment is exactly what's happening. I might also point out that when it comes to economic development, this is a strong card to play. This is one of the big reasons why some of these data centers have come here. A lot of water and a lot of renewable energy.
Thank you. Let's talk about, in the same kind of realm, another subject that came up, I think, in one of your opening statements, and that is water quality. How can the legislature work to improve water quality in the state of Iowa? And we'll go to Mark.
Well, there was a plan that came down last year, and the notion of it was that somehow we could scrape together enough money out of a tight budget to fund the nutrient reduction strategy, which is supposed to cost about $100 million a year. The money didn't add up to more than about 10 or 20 million. It wasn't going to be available for about 10 years, and it had originally been promised for school infrastructure. Look, we've got a problem with the nutrient disposal of this state's waters. I mean, we've got to do things in order to prevent what's happening and what you can see. I mean, you can't swim at a state park beach. The state of Louisiana is melting like a sugar cube in the mouth of the Mississippi River, and we're responsible for that, folks. It's what we send down in the way of nitrates and phosphates if we don't clean it up. The feds will tell us how to do it, and Tom Vilsack, our agriculture secretary, said they'll be held to pay. You want to fund it? Get the 3/8 cent tax increase to sales tax that will fund the Natural Resources and Outdoor Recreation Trust Fund and match that with a surtax on the fertilizers that are causing this.
I know that there was a plan proposed last year. I think that was definitely a good start in being a catalyst for the conversation about water quality and how we fund it. I did some quick research, obviously, ahead of the forum here tonight, and I think the legislature has appropriated about $170 million since 2011 to help address water quality. I know we have a great model here in eastern Iowa to take statewide, and that's the Middle Cedar Partnership. It's a private-public partnership that does involve some public money, but also does involve some private buy-in as well. Farmers in Iowa want to do the right thing, and many of them are already implementing these conservation practices that can help reduce the amount of nutrients that are going into the water, but they can also help maintain our soil quality, which is also an important part of this conversation going forward. So many of them are already doing the strips on the edges of their property. They're reducing the number of acres voluntarily, and they're investing money and time in making sure that our water quality is what it needs to be. So I support taking that strategy among some other funding strategies, which I think we do need to do at the legislative level, but I support taking that program statewide.
Well, this has spurred a few more questions to come from the audience, so let's tackle them while we're on it. One person notes that, and this is their comment, we haven't fact-checked it. South Australia has sorry? You were there, okay. South Australia has committed significant resources to renewable fuels. When they had a storm last month, the entire state had no power. How would you assure power in the deep of winter if you're going to rely on renewable energy? Ashley.
I think that begs the question of how our utilities are doing in storing energy. I admit it's not a topic that I am super familiar with, but my promise to people that I meet at the door is if I don't know an answer to a question, something specific like that, I'll look it up, do the research necessary, and get back to them. So just off the top of my head, what I would say is I would definitely ask the question, how are we storing energy so that we can make sure that it's available? How quickly can we mobilize our teams to get out there in the field? They typically bring in, I know, teams from outside states and regions to help us make sure that we're recovering. Many of you probably lived through the ice storm a couple years ago and know it was weeks until many people got power back on. So I would just say we need to make sure that we're double checking and we're prepared and our utilities are prepared, and then we make sure we hold them accountable as the recovery process continues.
Of course, you have to know what the load of your system is, and one of the things that I certainly know in regard to the use of electricity in this part of the nation is that it peaks during the summer months, not during the winter months. Generally speaking, there's going to be enough base load to handle that. The question that you might have is, well, how is this going to affect people that if they use net metering and have distributed generation who sell their power back to the utility? There's some question again in the utility board when they're looking at net metering as to when they're going to cash that out. Generally speaking, that's not the big problem. The big problem is whether we're going to continue to pollute the way that we have. You won't have to worry too much about whether we can keep warm in the winter at the rate things are going with global warming. So bear that in mind. But I agree with Ashley entirely. I'm not going to even pretend to be a pro when it comes to electrical production and distribution. What I do know, I know pretty well, though, and again, I think that this state's got a huge opportunity to lead when it comes to renewables.
Okay. Watersheds extend across county lines. That makes management and flood prevention more difficult. Improvement new sentence. When you turn 45, get your eyeglasses. We'll start over. Watersheds extend across county lines, which makes management and flood prevention more difficult. Should the state play a role in watershed improvement, and if so, what is that role? And we'll start with Mark.
Well, the state should certainly play a role. I mean, this is a statewide problem that we're talking about here. And that's why when I'm talking about the nutrient reduction strategy, I see a need to fund that and to extend it. I appreciate the voluntary things that farmers have done. However, the problem is participation isn't there. I certainly talk to farmers who have the grass waterways, the buffer strips, who've dedicated some portion of their land to doing what they need to do. But not everybody does and not everybody will, and I don't particularly blame the farmer because you've got to make every acre productive if you possibly can. The idea of funding the strategy is to give some incentive, some buffer in terms of finances to the farmer who, if they're going to use cover crops, if they're going to take land out of production, if they're going to abandon marginal lands, we'll give them some compensation for that. As far as what the state should do in regard to flood control, I appreciate the fact that the state has dedicated the necessary money to build the wall in Cedar Rapids. I'm disappointed that the federal government hasn't matched that. But again, this is a big government solution.
I think Iowa does have some great conservation leaders. I'm a member of the Cedar Rapids Metro Optimist Club, and we had an opportunity to hear one of those conservation leaders from right here in Lynn County come and speak about our watersheds and our county parks and the land that's available. And so I think we do have great watershed management here in the state, but I do think it does need to have some state involvement in that, especially as it pertains to water quality and protecting our land and our soil. I think I disagree with my opponent just a little bit on the funding issue because I think he's proposed a 1 cent tax on penny per pound?
Oh yeah, penny per pound.
Penny
absolutely.
per pound on fertilizer. And I don't think that's the way we fund it. I do think that would be a hit to Iowa farmers right now. Farm income is down. We have seen a 35% reduction in the last 3 years in corn and soybean and 25% in livestock. So we're down on revenue and farm, and so I don't think hitting our farmers to pay for it is the right idea.
Okay. Do you support climate science being taught to public school students? Ashley.
I support all conversations happening. I think every idea should be heard and a dialogue should happen about that in our classrooms. I think our teachers would be doing a disservice if they didn't engage students in a conversation about it. One thing I think, though, that I've learned as a journalist over the years is that there are sometimes more than two sides to a story. Sometimes there are multiple sides to a story, and I think that that's important, that we include all aspects in the education we give our students.
Mark?
Well, the thing about the scientific method is it doesn't admit that anything is absolute fact. So the idea that you would present both sides of the equation is definitely part of what an education involves. After all, education involves not filling a vessel but igniting a fire. That's the way you do things. Under the scientific method, you come up with the best theory to describe what you see. That involves observation, measurement. Facts need to be found, and then you make conclusions based upon what you've seen. You model it. That, incidentally, is how we've arrived at the conclusion that climate change is occurring. So I think it should be taught just as much as you should teach somebody current events or weather or anything else that is important to them and that they'll encounter on a daily basis and for the rest of their lives. It's true of evolution or anything else that you want to think about. We've got something called the Iowa Corps in this state. It was developed by Iowa educators and the Department of Education. That's a set of standards, not curriculum. We should follow that.
Okay, next question. Moving topics completely and going to surely a less controversial one. Do you support or oppose Medicaid privatization? The questioner wants to know, if you were in charge, what would you do about Medicaid? So we'll start with Mark.
Well, you know, if you can hear me back, there's kind of been a painful tendency in the presidential debates for people to talk as if they just have to make up their mind and things get done. But if I could do that, I would certainly reverse what I have called Terry care already here tonight, because the Medicaid privatization is, well, misbegotten from the first instant. You had a program that was run with a 4% overhead, which is almost unheard of in insurance, and that was paying some of the lowest service rates in the nation. You're not going to squeeze savings out of that. And then it was turned over to 3 private companies, all of which have been convicted of fraud in other states, all of which have to pay their CEOs, all of which have to pay their agents, which we didn't used to have. I don't understand why it happened in the first place. And interestingly, it's not just the people that are denied service. It's not just the people that can't get in at Mayo now like they used to. It's the doctors, the nurses, the clinics, the hospitals that are borrowing money because they can't get by.
So I'm not going to dwell on the past. I know we had to do something with our Medicaid program. The expense was growing. In fact, I believe the obligation was $100 million beyond what was budgeted just a few years ago before they made the change. So I know that they had to do something. I don't necessarily agree with the rollout. I think there have been some complications with it. But what I've been spending the last 11 months doing as a candidate is reaching out, meeting with people, and figuring out what's wrong. I've met with the heads of both hospitals in Cedar Rapids. I've met with the Iowa Hospital Association. I've met with one of the heads of the MCOs. And I've been following the Facebook group MCO Watchdog, which is more than 2,000 people who are sharing their experiences that they've had that have not always been positive about the Medicaid modernization. So I can tell you what I'm going to do as a legislator, which is go to Des Moines, listen to those concerns, take action when it's necessary, and I do think that's our obligation as a state. We have this program. What's done is done, in my opinion. All we can do is try to make it work for both providers and patients going forward.
Topic near and dear to my heart, and that's transportation. I served on the Iowa Department of Transportation Commission for 8 years, and I know that we have a lot of exciting projects coming up in eastern Iowa, but one questioner wants to know if you would oppose or support rapid transportation. So we'll go to Ashley.
Rapid transportation. I'm not actually sure what that is. Who asked the question? Do you mind clarifying? Can you clarify for me, please?
Yeah, I was clarifying the fact that Randstad set back federal funding for high-speed rail in Iowa. You said that it was unnecessary expenditure and people wouldn't use it. I was asking if you support or oppose Randstad's decision to kill high high-speed rail in Iowa?
I actually think high-speed rail would be a good investment, so I guess I would come out and say that I disagree with the governor on that. I think if the money is available in the budget, we should take action on it, because I do think it would be a great economic development tool for us. I mean, think about opening up those lines of transportation. I would have taken it. I know we were planning, I believe the initial plan was to go between Iowa City and Chicago at one point. It was scaled back and then obviously cut altogether. I think that, again, it leads to not only an economic development potential, but also just a quality of life potential for Iowans. I think Iowans love the chance to be able to travel. Chicago's a great city, Illinois is a great state. We can, share some resources there, recruit some people to come here, and just make business easier. So I disagree with the governor there on making the choice to not fund that kind of a rail potential for the state of Iowa. I think it would be great.
Well, let's tack on some time, and we'll do it for both folks, because the issue also was that there were going to have to be ongoing costs. There would have to be what some people call subsidization, or whether other people might say is a commitment to changing the face of transportation. So given that there would be ongoing costs, that would be the responsibility of the state. Would you support that?
If we could fund it in a way that was sustainable and the money was there, then absolutely I would. But I wouldn't want to fund it and then not have it be a sustainable way going forward.
Okay. And so the question is, do you support rapid transportation? And, if you do, are you willing to budget state dollars to support year in, year out some operational budget?
Well, I think Ashley and I are essentially in agreement about this. There definitely should be rapid transit in the state. We definitely should invest in it. And this is part of the overall vision of creating a state which has the potential to get away from reliance on fossil fuels and take care of itself in terms of energy. And we can make these trains run on the electricity that we produce that's renewable, for that matter. Have these trains run from Davenport to Iowa City. That's a corridor where we know that there are going to be a lot of people coming in from Chicago who are going to be taking that route. If you want to talk about subsidization, bear in mind that the wear and tear that your average semi puts on an Iowa road is 100 times what my car will put on that road. And we're rebuilding that road. We are subsidizing that way of travel. Certainly we can subsidize this too. I do agree it should be as close to possible pay as you go. It should be economically something that works. I'm a capitalist. I believe that things should profit by dint of their own attractiveness. But this is one where we need to get it started, and I would be very happy to encourage rail, and also an interurban between here and Iowa City.
Okay. Thank you both. Let's see, let's talk about TIF. When a property qualifies for TIF, no property taxes are applied to our school districts for the duration of the tax increment financing period. Should Iowa consider eliminating tax incentives that reduce funding for our schools? Mark.
I think that we need to decide what our priorities are. Are our priorities to create more shopping centers, or are our priorities to provide an education for our children? Because I'm seeing tax incremental financing, which was supposed to be a tool for revitalizing urban core centers, as what has become the basis for Coral Ridge Mall and all of the development around First Avenue in Coralville. Basically, that city's turned itself inside out with it, but in the meantime, the school districts are starving for funding. So, yeah, it is time to curtail that. It's a government giveaway that nobody should have ever really received. It's created an economic incentive that distorts. And for that matter, when you build a Coral Ridge, you have to tear down a Westdale. It's one of those things where you're essentially cannibalizing. Now, why are we subsidizing cannibalization of retail space? It seems like something government should have nothing to do. Well, you know what? It's something government should have nothing to do with.
I think TIF is a valuable tool in the toolbox for economic development, but I do think that it can be overused, and that I think is exactly what happened in Coralville. It was overused. I do think, though, that it creates a great balance for communities to be able to attract more people to their school districts as well. You create a good place to live with great businesses, great retail centers, great industry, great restaurants. You're going to bring more people to your area as well, and that will also feed your property tax base and help your schools. So I think that there is a place for it in the development toolbox, but I do think that it can be sometimes overused by our municipalities as well.
Okay, moving on to a different topic, gun laws. Will you oppose legislation to liberalize Iowa's gun laws? Ashley.
Well, let me just start by saying this. I am a Second Amendment supporter, and I don't see a reason to change our gun laws as they stand right now. I didn't have to take a test or pass any questionnaire to practice my First Amendment right to be a journalist. And so I don't think that we should change the Second Amendment as I see it right now. And that's all I have to say about that, actually. So I'll keep it short.
Okay,
Pretty short and sweet.
there you go, Mark.
I've read the Constitution, and beyond that, I've read the Federalist Papers, which is where Madison, Hamilton, you've heard of him, and Jay explained what they meant by that Constitution. And there was one thing that Madison said in there that really struck me. He said that one area in which the citizens of the United States benefit beyond the citizens of any other nation on earth is by the general ownership of firearms. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be any smarter than our founding fathers. I am and will be a Second Amendment Democrat. I understand that a gun, when you're 30 minutes away from the sheriff, is a tool that you need to possess. And I understand how guns have requirements, too. You have to know how to handle it. Well, you know what? We already have a training requirement in the law. At this point in time, I don't know what is meant by further liberalization of the gun laws. But at this point in time, I don't see any reason to scale them back, if that's what it means.
Sentencing. Would you be in favor of reducing mandatory minimum sentences for non-violent drug offenses? Mark.
Or abolishing them. You know, there was a fair amount of magical thinking that took place in the 1980s. I mean, things like trickle-down economics. But one of the things that was really crazy was the drug war. That if we had these draconian sentences, that somehow that was going to eliminate drug use in inner city neighborhoods. And in fact, what it did was criminalize an entire generation of inner city youth. And we've been suffering from that since. These laws don't work. There were many federal judges that quit when they found out that they no longer had discretion. That it didn't matter whether the Senate had approved them and the President appointed them. They were supposed to just basically be like vending machines dispensing 30-year sentences for simple possession. No, I think you need to restore discretion. And I think you've also seen recently from the Supreme Court a series of decisions that indicate the mandatory minimums are going to get strict scrutiny henceforth.
I don't agree with abolishing them. I think if you do the crime, you should do the time. I do agree with having a conversation about the amount of time that it involves. I agree our prisons are overpopulated with people who maybe don't, or they have been rehabilitated, they realize what they've done, and they probably have done their time. So I do think it begs definitely having a conversation at the state level about how we do that going forward. I know this past legislative session there was some reaffirmation of sentencing for certain crimes and certain offenders. Representative Reiser, who's here tonight, led that charge, and that was signed into law this past session. So I look forward to working with him and other members of the Iowa House on changing those guidelines or working on the conversation at least surrounding them. I do think that's something we need to go forward with, especially since we are in tight funding years, and our state prisons, of course, are a topic of that conversation as well.
I'll do a follow-up question on this subject. Some states are exploring other ways to deal with drug crimes, such as drug court or restorative justice principles. Would you be in favor of looking at a solution like that?
And we actually have a great option here in the 6th Judicial District as well. There is a drug court program here. I think that that's something we definitely need to look into supporting. There are definitely candidates for that who probably would be better served and rehabilitated that way. So I like options that challenge people to be better people, especially when they're trying to pay for the crime that they've done. So yes, I would absolutely be in support of that approach to these crimes.
Mark?
Well, yeah, to begin with, I would always very much commend Judge Hoover Grindy's drug court, and I think that is an excellent thing that we do here in the 6th Judicial District. It's saving lives and it's making lives better. It's saving families, and this is the sort of thing that we should be doing with drug offenders rather than mandatory minimums. One of the things about mandatory minimums is one minute of incarceration beyond what is just is unconstitutional. Bear that in mind. So when we help people get beyond their problems, we are doing the right thing. I also want to point out that in relation to this, Iowa has a problem with mental health. The de facto fallback mental health care provider is the county jail. Iowa ranks 51st among the 50 states and the District of Columbia in terms of mental health beds. And we have just seen in the last couple of years that mental health institutes in Clarinda and Mount Pleasant were closed. We need to do something to take care of people who are, after all, ill.
Well, great segue, because someone asked that question. What would you specifically do to improve the mental health system? So we'll start with Mark.
Well, the first thing to do would be to reopen those institutions. They are providing care that Iowans need, and we're going in the wrong direction in terms of number of beds. I know that in Davenport there was a hospital that was fighting a long, hard battle, and I don't think they ever succeeded in getting a certificate of need to put in some additional mental health beds. I don't know why that wasn't forthcoming from the state. I think we need to look at how the state board is responding to requests to build up to meet the need for mental health beds in this state. And I think that's where we need to start.
Thank you. Ashley?
I don't agree with reopening them at this point, but I don't think they should have closed without a plan going forward. So let me just clarify that right off the bat here. I know there were some problems with one of those mental institutions, actually, because they even had to contract with a doctor out of Missouri because they couldn't get a doctor to manage that facility here in Iowa. And I know that was an extreme cost to Iowa taxpayers. So I do think we need to take a look at the per capita funding rate that was put into place when they did a mental health redesign and changed things to the 9-county district that we have here in eastern Iowa. I just talked to a social worker last night, actually, who had spent some time working in St. Luke's ER, and she mentioned patients were there sometimes for 2 days waiting for beds, and that's truly unacceptable, and I don't think that's fair to anybody. So I think we do need to have that conversation at the state level. I would propose, again, talking about that per capita cap so that it's equal between counties, so we can make sure that people are getting the services that they need and are entitled to in a timely fashion. Many of those people are in crisis, and they need those services now. They can't wait.
Thank you. Capital punishment. Iowa has repealed the death penalty twice. If a bill to reinstate capital punishment was introduced, would you support or oppose it? Ashley?
I would definitely consider it, but at this point I don't think it would be responsible to tell you how I would vote one way or another. I think unless I had the bill language in front of me, I just don't think it's responsible to give an opinion one way or another. As we all know, things get snuck into legislation all the time. So just know I would be a part of that conversation.
Well, let's change the question just a little bit, because I think what the person's trying to get at is whether you're a supporter or opponent of capital punishment. So as a general concept, are you a supporter or opponent of capital punishment?
I do believe in eye for eye punishment, and at this point I would support the death penalty.
Okay, thank you. So Mark, same question to you. If it was a bill in front of you, would you comment on whether you'd support or oppose it, and make clear your position on capital punishment generally, please?
Well, the first thing I want to say is I do not believe in an eye for an eye, because as Gandhi observed, that's what makes the whole world blind. I think what you need to think about, when I think about capital punishment, I do admit of the possibility that it may be right in certain circumstances. However, I'm being asked what my policy would be on this at this point in time. I'm asked, how would you evaluate capital punishment, generally speaking, as a policy choice? I look at it, generally speaking, it's heinous, because people die who are innocent. Because people, if 1 minute of incarceration is too long and unconstitutional, how about spending 20 or 30 years waiting to die before somehow somebody's finally able to exonerate you? Well, I can't see capital punishment as being a good policy choice. And as a lawyer, I know that it is the more expensive choice when you look at all the appeals that go into a capital sentence. If this state's going to save money, I don't think that's where it wants to throw it away.
Thank you. Next question is voting rights. Would you work to restore voting rights to felons who have served their sentence? Mark.
I guess my point of view in regard to punishment is what I'm trying to achieve is rehabilitation. It's also the way that I look at drug courts. What I'm trying to do is change a life. to save a life. If I'm a Christian, that's what I should do. Now, as far as voting rights for felons, I don't know when punishment should end, but if someone has served their sentence, if someone has paid their debt, if someone has shown themselves to be a productive member of society, has succeeded in rehabilitation, I don't know why to deny them then the opportunity to be a citizen again. I mean, I guess like capital punishment, if you make a punishment irrevocable, that's like telling somebody that there's no chance. I don't agree with that. And I think that there are some people who have come back from committing felonies. I don't know, Don King, O. Henry, there are a few in American history. Should they not vote?
Iowa does have recourse for felons to get their voting rights back. I've actually taken a look at the form that you have to fill out to do so. I think they've actually reduced the amount of pages that it is to make it easier. But you do have to answer questions specifically about your crime, the time you've spent in prison, your thoughts on rehabilitation. It's a pretty thoughtful questionnaire, and I think it gives a pretty good idea for the governor to decide if you should have your right back. And I think that right now is a great process to go through to vet people to make sure that they deserve and they are rehabilitated and, from my opinion, deserve that right to vote again. So I think we have a good system in place in Iowa already for felons to try and get their voting rights back.
Someone wanted me to go back to healthcare and ask again kind of a more broad policy type question, which is, do you believe in universal healthcare? And we'll start with Ashley. I suppose in the form of a government-run system.
I think there are many people who don't want to enroll in healthcare programs, and that's their choice. And I believe that should be their choice. I do think if somebody wants healthcare, there should be a plan that's available and affordable to them. And I think we've definitely got that here in Iowa. Medicaid is a good program for people who have income-based needs. But I do not think anybody should be forced to buy health care and then be penalized for it. So that's my thought on health care.
But on the other hand, should people that have health care, the means to pay for the care that they receive, be the ones that in effect subsidize those that make the poor choice not to get it? There are laws that say that a hospital is required to give you emergency care until you're stabilized. That's a requirement that the government places on the funding that it sends to hospitals. You're going to provide care. So when you choose not to be responsible, that's a choice we as taxpayers are going to come to bear. There are all kinds of questions that one can ask about how health care functions as a so-called market. I don't, generally speaking, determine who I'm going to get my broken leg fixed by on the basis of price shopping. I don't go from one hospital to the other. I can tell you that services, if they're paid by workers' compensation, Medicare, Medicaid, private health insurance, or not at all by any of those, you're going to get 5 different prices. Imagine going to McDonald's and getting a hamburger for anything from $10 to $1.20. This is a strange system and it needs to be changed.
Another broad policy question, taking us back to voting. The writer says, the United States is the only country in the Western world that rescinds voting rights for crimes unrelated to election laws. Should we reevaluate our policy on voting rights? Mark.
Well, I think it's here in Iowa that we have a definition in our Constitution that the voting privilege can be revoked for infamous crimes. And I guess when I'm thinking about this question, what I wonder is, what does the word infamous mean? And generally speaking, it's a word that's defined by the legislature. It implies to me that what we're looking at is not a restriction based upon something like whether you are OWI, but whether you would do something that is so contrary to human nature or contrary to human ethics that then you would not be expected to be an honest or decent person to make a decision on who should serve you. And again, I think that it is not inappropriate to qualify return of the voting privilege on whether one has completed one's rehabilitation. So I am happy with the system that we have here. I just want to see it function better.
I don't think we need to change anything either. I think we do have a good system, as I referenced earlier, in Iowa for people to try and get their voting rights back. And I do think that's a punishment, that when you make a conscious choice and do an infamous crime, in our case, defining it as a felony, then I do think that that's a price you should have to pay, and you can do your due diligence to try to get your right back.
Okay, still on voter registration and voting. Do you support requiring voter identification to be presented at the time of voting? And do you support same-day voter registration? Ashley?
I think same-day voter registration has definitely opened up our state to a lot of fraud, but I do like the idea of allowing people the option of showing up and exercising their right to vote. So I think we just need to do a better job of ensuring that people are who they say they are when they show up at the polls, and that we're doing our due diligence to check to make sure their vote should count. So I would say that I do support same-day voter registration, and we do need to make sure we have some checks in place. I think 33 states actually already have voter ID laws in place. Iowa's not one of them at this point. I would like to see some form of voter ID requirement at the voting booth. I think that that is a very clear way of being able to define that you are who you say you are.
I remember briefly I lived in Milwaukee. I remember the first time I wanted to participate in an election there, and I was disappointed to tell my coworkers at State Farm that I hadn't registered, and they said, just take your utility bill. I did, and I voted. I was an honest man. I was not a fraudster, believe me. So I guess what I'm thinking about is we had money allocated to this state to promote voting that was used by Matt Schultz when he was Secretary of State from 2011 to 2015 to root out any instances of voter fraud he could find statewide. I believe there were 5 charges. I believe there were 2 convictions in the entire state for all of the elections encompassing the time that he served in office and some years before. We just don't have a problem there, folks. I don't believe in voter identification because there are a lot of seniors and there are a lot of very young people who wouldn't be able to provide what would be considered to be an adequate identification. This is a non-problem and it doesn't require a solution.
Okay. I'm going to move on to some general questions in the time that we have remaining. And this is a pretty interesting broad question from one of the audience members. What is the most frequent issue that you've heard from your constituents when you've been meeting with them or door knocking? Mark.
Well, it's kind of like, you'd like to think of the ones that you've heard the most, because I don't know whether any one is the most frequent, but I would say probably it's education. And probably it's the number of people, a surprising number, that keep saying, yeah, 32 kids per classroom. They talk about what their children aren't getting, that are worried about whether arts programs and music programs are going to continue, and language programs. I hear that a great deal. I hear about Medicaid a lot. I hear about that at doors again when I'm talking to people who need the program and people who are providers under the program. And yes, I met with the Iowa Hospital Association myself, and Ted Townsend very much set me straight on what it was costing him to have Medicaid privatization. But the environment, last night was a good one. 3 different doors brought up that 3/8 cent sales tax increase to fund that trust fund we as voters approved by 63% 6 years ago. It's never been funded. Farm Bureau wants to spend all of that on cleaning up after farmers. Most people want to spend some of that on trails and parks.
Well, I'm going to focus on one issue because it comes up at a lot of doors, and it's please don't raise my taxes. We live in an area, in a district that does have very high property taxes already. In fact, I think it does do good things for our schools. My son is in a class of 20 in the Linn-Mar district, so I know there is great variance. That may be the top, but there are classes that are small, so I think it's important to point that out. But the number one issue I hear at doors is please don't raise my taxes. And that's something that I will do my best to avoid doing.
What committees do you hope to serve on if elected, and why?
Okay. Let's see. I think as a mother and as a woman, I would love to serve on the education committee. I do think that that is a priority for me, and it's a selfish reason, of course, because I do have a kindergartner and then one that will be coming up through the school system. I would like to be a part in crafting the future of education in Iowa, changing the way we talk about what we do in classrooms. And one of the first things I would do actually is form an education advisory committee when I'm elected. formed with teachers, parents, school board members, retired administrators, anybody really who wants to be involved. So education committee would be something that I would like to serve on. And then transportation committee. I think we have some really unique opportunities to establish an even better infrastructure in this state. We can be smart about those decisions. Actually, right now, a DOT meeting is happening at Hiawatha City Hall, where they're talking about the Tower Terrace intersection. I would love to be a part of expanding those conversations at the state level, serving on the transportation committee.
Well, we're going to bump. I'd also like to be on the education committee. In the course of running for office, I've talked to guys like Bill Huntoon from the Marion District and Jim Green from the Linn-Mar District, and I would very much like to participate in improving education in this state, in getting it funded again, and making sure the Common Core remains in place, the Iowa Core. I think that as an attorney, certainly, I would see that the Judiciary Committee would have some appeal to me. And when we're talking about sentencing, we're talking about things like law enforcement. It's a very important committee. I want to comment that one of the things that many of us are aware of is the laws of the state may be very good laws, but if we do not fund our courts, as we have, quite frankly, not been doing a good job of lately, then those laws will not be enforced. Those cases will not advance. And if justice delayed is justice denied, then that's something that we need to support as a state value, that co-equal branch. And I would like to be on the Judiciary Committee as well as the Education Committee.
Well, education continues to be a hot topic, funding issues, and I know this has been in the news recently, not only in Iowa, but also nationwide, and that is over school lunches. So a couple of questions. You know, there's some issues where some districts don't have the funding to continue to front some parents who are not keeping up on the lunch accounts, lunch money for their children, and there have been varying ways of handling that issue and a lot of upset in the media about it. So how would you address that issue for schools?
I believe you're referring to the recent column about the Linn-Mar student who was denied lunch and it was thrown away in front of her face. And I agree that was probably not a good way to handle that problem. My son is, as I mentioned, a kindergarten in the Linn-Mar school district. And I know that at the elementary level, they will never deny a child a meal. And I think that's really important. And I think at the elementary level, they can't defend themselves if their parents are not putting money in their lunch account or they happen to come from a low-income family. So I do think that policy is a good one at the elementary level. And I'm not familiar with every school district in the state of Iowa, but I would assume that many have a similar policy. That said, at the high school level, I don't think you as a school district can subsidize everybody at a high school level. I think that is irresponsible budgeting practices. I think at that point students need to be taught responsibility as well. I agree though that the way that situation unfolded and was handled in the Linn-Mar district was probably not the best.
Well, let's do a follow-up question to this, and we'll do it with both and add time for both. And one of the follow-up questions is, should we just make sure that all lunch is free, for example, as a solution?
Yeah.
Would you be in favor of that solution?
I don't think that's the solution. I think that could be a great cost, and I think we do need to definitely address it at the elementary level. If elementary students are not getting a meal, then I think that is of concern, and I think that's why school districts have made it a priority to fund at the elementary level.
Okay. But the same amount of time, please.
2 minutes for one.
Okay. Well, we have a free and reduced price lunch program, and that program is often used as a metric for determining when you've got a school or a population of students that's particularly in need. So we do provide for many students, and in some districts most, the ability to have a lunch which is subsidized or paid for entirely. So that need is being addressed. I think as far as what the individual school district does when they have a family or a child that's been non-compliant with the program, there should be a more generous policy, frankly, than Linn-Mar employed. I don't like to think that, well, you do need food to get an education. I don't think that you're going to really get a very good day of schooling, and if you're constantly thinking about your growling belly, and I think that a school is one place where you should make allowances. It would not be a bad thing. I mean, I volunteer at Green Square meals all the time. I know that there's a cornucopia of food available, certainly schools can make arrangements in order to benefit from that. Now, this is a great state for making sure that people are provided for. This is frankly a city where you can get 3 squares 7 days a week without paying for any of them. I would think that a school administrator could find the mercy and the administrative ability to tap into the resources that are available from HACAP and others to make sure that everyone's taken care of. So I think that's a problem that we can work our way through.
Okay. Is there anything that you can do to unite our country and help us work together? I know you mentioned collaboration at the beginning. What would be your key word or your goal, Mark, for having a collaborative and a unified government? Solve that problem, Mark.
Now, if she was Hillary and I was Donald, could you imagine how much fun we'd be having tonight? We'd be having no fun at all. I think that what you're looking for are people that are going to talk about issues and that aren't going to talk about things that just make people angry at one another. And I respect my opponent. And this has been my fortune 4 years ago when I ran against Craig Paulson to run against an opponent who I haven't got a bad thing to say about as a person, but with whom I disagree in regard to policy. You've got to look at these things and you've got to figure out that the other person is not the devil. The other person might be your collaborator. It was Lincoln who said that he liked to destroy his enemies by making them his friends, and I think that's a good principle for any politician to have. So I would start with that attitude. And I like what Barton Malley said when he spoke in Cedar Rapids. Run a bill. If it doesn't win, find out why. Work on the people you need to get the votes. Trade horses. Get it done.
I mentioned collaboration because I think a healthy discourse about any topic or conversation is a good thing. I think good policy comes from that conversation, and collaboration is the first way that you do get things done. And I think our federal lawmakers could take a lesson from what we've done here in Iowa, which is pass a lot of really good policy with a lot of bipartisan effort. I have served on a lot of nonpartisan boards. We are solution-driven people. You get things done regardless of your party or your personal background, and that is what I would take to the State House as a leader there. I think that you have to be solution-focused, and you do that with, again, those communicative efforts and that collaboration and that creativity that I mentioned in my opening statement. I think that is how you lead, that is how you make good policy, and I do think that the federal leaders could look to us here in Iowa as a good beacon for that progress.
Still taking questions on education, and we still have time, so I'm going to keep taking them. This one is a question about the issue of how many hours students actually spend in the classroom as opposed to the number of professional hours that teachers are using or days off, etc. Do you think that the balance is a good balance in Iowa with respect to learning hours and professional development hours?
I do, and I do think professional development is important, no matter what your job is. So I do support professional development hours being given to our teachers so that they have the tools that they need to go back into the classroom. I mentioned earlier the Iowa Big program, and that takes students out of that traditional classroom setting. They still get the same number of hours, but they get a different experience. I think the more we can do as a state to offer those different experiences to our students, outside of the classroom in traditional settings, I think that's a great tool for us to lead the way nationally and have our students emerge as leaders. I got a chance to go with my son to the pumpkin patch on Friday as a field trip. Whatever we can do to encourage schools and help them make that happen for our students and give them those opportunities to learn outside of the traditional classroom setting, I think is a really, really great thing. So I support the current structure that we have here, which is a nice balance, I think, of classroom time, professional development for our teachers, and of course giving students any opportunity we can to enrich their education.
Well, I also think we have a good proportion of professional development in classroom hours, and that's important, again, for making teaching a profession and not just a job. There's a question that I've had in my own mind, though, about the deployment that we have chosen to make. There are master teachers or lead teachers that have sort of been set aside in order to, at least the idea is, somehow enrich the ability of other teachers to do their jobs. Unfortunately, I think that what that has really resulted in is a misallocation of resources. Instead of frontline teachers, we're paying more to some people who are basically supposed to be coaches, but are still trying to teach a classroom while they're getting paid to do what exactly, I don't know. I think we need to think about whether we go back. This was something that was part of an education bill a few years ago, and I think we need to concentrate our resources on frontline teachers, especially when there are 32 kids on the front line.
Next question is about sexual education in schools. Do you think that sexual education is limited, or is it sufficiently being taught? And do you think that as part of that classroom experience that LGBTQ issues should be addressed? Mark.
You know, I have to admit, I don't know specifically what the curriculum is for sexual education at this point in time in Iowa schools. I'm sorry for that. My children didn't talk about it very much with me, and I respected that. So I would say that, but when I look at it, the thing that I think is important in any such class is you have to dispel ignorance. Ignorance is the enemy to planning, to making good decisions, to understanding yourself, which is important. And I think that everything should be taught, not as a way of life, but as something that may be encountered, experienced, or may be a part of who you are. I don't think people choose their orientation. I think it chooses them. Beyond that, though, I do want to say that we need to do something about bullying in this state, because concomitantly with our concern for teaching about LGBTQ, we also have to respect their rights and avoid bullying. And we haven't allocated any money to that.
I echo the bullying comment. I'll just lead off with that. I led a forum actually up at Wartburg College, Stand Up, Speak Up to Bullying. And I think that those issues about orientation, gender, those were all brought up in that conversation. And I think they do need to be a part of the conversation. That's an age when you're going through so many things emotionally. My mother was a guidance counselor. She was a teacher for a long time, an art teacher in Newton, but she got her graduate degree at Drake and then went on to be a guidance counselor. And so she shared with me some of the experiences she had in talking with students. And I think that that's a crucial age. And if you can talk to someone and have an open, honest conversation, you're going to do a lot of good instead of a lot of bad. As far as sex education is concerned, I think I went through sex education in 6th grade. But by 7th and 8th grade, I knew fellow classmates were already sexually active. So I think that's a conversation that needs to happen, and we need to talk about it. It's not something we need to be shy about. We as adults need to be leaders in talking with our young people about it as well.
A follow-up question from the audience on this topic. Do you support abstinence education as part of the curriculum for sexual education?
I actually had a really good conversation with the president of Bridgehaven here in Cedar Rapids, and they are a pregnancy support center, but they were actually trying to get into schools to do a program on abstinence. They were having some struggles in getting in and teaching that as an option, and I think that as a part of the bigger sexual activity conversation, abstinence should be presented as an option to all students.
Thank you.
Well, I didn't know abstinence was not generally an option unless it was taught. But my point of view is this: you're there to get information, and you're not there to be told how to make a decision. And besides which, I think the biggest problem with abstinence education is a lot of us will make a good, logical decision when we're confronted in a neutral situation with that. But then I know that there are enough things that happen at the universities, that happen at proms, when decision making isn't good. Now, you're going to have to teach people about that more than you're going to have to teach them about abstinence, which I think is a good idea and certainly should be believed in and taught at home. But I think you're there to get information. You're there to find out what you don't know, what you can't already see might need to be part of your plan for having your life the way you would choose it to be.
I'm going to ask one more question before we go into closing statements. And this one is a general question just to give the audience a feel for you as a person. What would you say is the most valuable volunteer experience that you've had in your community? We'll start with Mark.
Well, that's hard to say. I mean, I certainly, again, I've enjoyed being part of the Green Square Board, and it's nice to think that when people come in, my attitude about it is, I thank them for coming. I hope that they give me a tip. I mean, I want to make people feel as though they're welcome, as if what they're receiving is from the heart, and as if they're equal to anybody. I feel like I just want to provide, I want to help. You know, just a couple of weeks ago, I think we were all proud, those of us who participated, and I think most of you probably did, in doing what we could to save our city. Didn't it feel good? I mean, the fact that that actually came through, that's a very important thing. But then I think also the time that I served on the Alzheimer's board, that's another lesson in what you have to learn about what you can and what you can't accomplish, and the most that you can do. You can certainly provide respite and you can provide hope, but we haven't provided the end yet.
I would echo what Mark said about our saving our community. It was amazing to watch. I went through the 2008 flood, and of course I was on the air at that time helping deliver information, but this most recent time I was out sandbagging. My husband actually took his Saturday to go with me. We moved a couple out of their house, and they were in the flood zone, and just seeing the look, how grateful they were, that was incredibly gratifying. I would say the thing though that I think I've gotten the most out of is taking part in America Reads every year. I just actually signed up to read at Westfield Elementary in Prairie in a couple of weeks, and you talk about a real problem in our state, it's early literacy. And I have had great experiences taking part in America Reads. You have a great option as an adult to show kids that reading is fun and it's a great tool. For me, it was a lot of what I based my career on as a journalist was an incessant appetite for reading. So I think volunteering as an America Reads volunteer every year for the past decade has been a great part of my volunteer experience here in Eastern Iowa.
Okay, well, thank you all for your wonderful questions and for your thoughtful answers this evening. Pursuant to the rules that we set forth at the beginning of this forum, each candidate has 2 minutes to provide a closing statement. And because Mark opened, we'll start with Ashley.
All right. So again, thank you all for coming tonight. I think it's great to take part in the political process and be here and taking your questions. Not all candidates chose to do that, so thank you, Mark, for agreeing to be here tonight as well. Thank you again to the League of Women Voters for hosting this opportunity. I have devoted myself to service since a very young age. It's the backbone of why I'm running for this office, and I think that going forward you can rely on me to be a trusted, proven leader. I mentioned those things at the beginning, communication, collaboration, and creativity. And I want to focus on those 3 specifically because I think that every leader should have those in the back of their mind as they're going forward, trying to make good policy, answer voters' questions, and really act on the best interest of their constituents. So I plan to lead with service in mind. It's a commitment to community that I think really you do give back what you put into your community, and I am a great believer in that. So going forward, that's the type of leader I'm going to be for you. I will be available. One of the reasons I think we both go out and knock on doors so much is because we want voters to know we care, we're on your doorstep, and we are accessible to you. So if you don't have my phone number yet, I've been giving out my cell phone number. It's everywhere. So please call me with any questions that you have. I want you to keep that attitude going forward. And I will say this too, I do plan to serve in a bipartisan way. One of us, regardless of what happens here tonight, will be your state representative here in District 67. So I would just say that if it's me, I will go to Mark for counsel. I think that's important. He has connections that I don't have, and I think we need to utilize those connections. And I would offer Mark, if it's you, that I am a good resource for you as well. And I think that that kind of leadership going forward will serve you well, and I ask for your vote in District 67. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark?
And I certainly think that to be effective in this state, you need to reach across the aisles. We're not embittered and separated by our politics in such a way that we can't be reasonable and we can't get things done. And primarily, that's what's important, is getting things done. There are things we need to do in this state. There are responsibilities that we have to our children. There are responsibilities that we have to our land, and we need to fulfill them. I've heard a little bit about 3 C's. What I'm running on are 3 E's. And the first E, of course, as you've heard, and I'm sure you know that this is primarily what I'm interested in, is education. We need to restore allowable growth funding. Education is our brand. We put the schoolhouse on our quarter. We need to raise good children. It's what we do around here. And we need to put our money where our mouth is. If that's the promise that we make to the future, is the education that we provide to our children, then we must provide that education. The second E is the environment. And we need to do something about our water quality problems in this state. And again, I'll be very specific. I've proposed funding the Natural Resources Trust Fund with the 3/8 sales tax increase that 63% of us approved, and matching that with a surtax on fertilizer, because after all, there's no sales tax on fertilizer that a farmer pays. And when the Farm Bureau said, let's raise that 3/8 sales tax, that's not a tax a farmer will pay. That's a tax city people pay. Let's match that. Let's make it a city-county solution. But we need to do it. We need to get our waters cleaned up. And the finally is the economy. Because the future of this state requires that we provide a quality education to families that live here for their children. And it requires that someday those children are going to be able to find employment here. And I think this will be a much more enjoyable, better state, more competitive in every sense. If we've taken care of our education and our environment, our economy will grow. Thank you very much.
And now you can applaud. I'd like to close the forum, thanking Kirkwood for allowing us to use this facility, thanking Robin Cash at Neighborhood Network News for taping it. You can see this on the League of Women Voters, LynnCounty.org, LWVLynnCounty.org, and NeighborhoodNetworkNews.com. And of course, thanks to you both, and remember to vote. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.